for you making time. My name is Aaron Dworkin. I'm the CEO of the National Summer Learning Association. We have a great policy briefing today and panel with wonderful partners and experts from the After School Alliance, the American Camp Association, Boys and Girls Club of America, Communities and Schools, as well as NSLA, and the YMCA USA is one of our co-sponsors for today's event today. I will just go over a few ground rules here. I can move my slide. Not letting me. Allie, can you? Oh, here we go. Sorry. All right. So here's what we want to say. Everyone who's joining us are in listen only mode, so you're not going to be able to speak. This webinar is being recorded. It will be shared out. Link and slides will be made available. And because of the amount of material we're trying to cover and the number of speakers, we won't have time for a live question and answer period, but we ask everyone to please put your questions into the Q&A function, and our panelists we're going to take a look at all the questions, bucket them by category in the next few days, create responses and share out with everyone who is joining us today. Again, please put all those questions in the chat or the Q&A, and then, like we said, we'll put up a follow-up FAQ. So just a quick moment of context, and then we will get to our first presenters. But we know we're talking about the federal funding that was passed as part of the overall federal plan that passed last week. And we're talking about the funding specifically for education and out of school time and helping all of America's young people like we all care about. We're all racing so fast, and we're about to run into how do we access this funding and how do we use it to the best of our abilities. But I just want to take one breath, a moment of pause and appreciation and reflection on the great accomplishment that this funding is for the entire out of school time field, especially, but all of us who have for decades been working very hard to keep raising the level of quality and services and creating infrastructure and research and from the philanthropic community, investing in our intermediaries and everything that has created a field which in a moment of emergency allows our federal leaders to stop and quickly say, all right, we know who to invest in at this moment to help young people, and that's all of you. I also want to just encourage all of us to remember, I know we are very focused on this summer and the coming school year, but this investment is multiple year focus. So we will do as much as we can to help kids recover from this pandemic, but just know that we don't have to do it all in 6 weeks and 8 weeks. We have some time to pace ourselves. It's a multi-year effort. I believe very firmly that we can do both, focus on program quality and serve a large quantity of America's children at the same time. Sometimes people phrase it either or. We believe we know what works. We've invested in quality, all our organizations, all our partners, our research folks. We know how to do this well, and we can also have the infrastructure to reach millions of young people. When we are working together like we're demonstrating today, we can avoid redundancy, create efficiencies. When we focus on youth collaboration and creativity, all the various silos that we've created around education and youth development fade away as we all respond and work together, and we're doing that. This is summer, and next year also is a chance for us to model what great partnerships look like between school districts and other youth-serving government agencies and nonprofits. So I'm really excited to put that highly on display. Again, no one has to feel like they're reinventing the wheel. We have tons of research, tons of resources, best practice, curriculum, staff training, assessment tools, and there's even more being produced by so many partners on this call. And we're going to find ways to compile that and make it easy for everyone to access them. I'll just do a little plug that in this coming summer, we have something that we always do called National Summer Learning Week from July 12th through 16th, where it's a chance for us to lift up what everyone is going to be doing and get more attention for this wonderful use of funds that people are going to be implementing and how important everyone's work is. Again, this is a chance for us to demonstrate the high return on investment, the high value of investments in the out of school time field and our partnerships in education, and to leave a legacy that will hopefully have continued annual increased investments in all our work and all our children in our field, and not just as an emergency, but as something that's a priority for our country and our young people going forward. So with that said, I would love to turn it over to Allie Calcott, the Legislative Counsel for National Summer Learning Association, to share her first part of this section about unpacking what is in this bill. Allie.
Awesome. Next slide, please, Aaron.
Trying to move it.
Perfect. Okay. So Aaron, do you just want to quickly, before I start, just give an overview of everybody on the call, and then we'll go into mine?
Well, we've said who we have. We said the organizations. So we
Okay.
have Ali, we have Eric Peterson, who many of you know from the After School Alliance. Very fortunate to have him. Sage, Lauren and Kate Cabo from Government Relations from Boys and Girls Club of America, Tiffany Miller from Communities and Schools, and Henry DeHart, the Chief Operating Officer of American Camp Association. All great leaders and experts. So we'll take it away.
Awesome. Next slide, please. And so this is just a quick, yep, perfect. All right, awesome. So as Aaron mentioned, I am Ali Talcott, and I'm legislative counsel for NSLA, and I am extremely grateful to be leading all of the federal policy work alongside our coalition partners in this historic moment for summer and after school programs and for the entire out of school time community as a whole. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of the most recent COVID-19 relief package, the American Rescue Plan, I wanted to provide a quick overview of the previous COVID-19 packages given after school and summer learning are allowable uses of funding in those laws as well. And there is a lot of interplay between the three packages at this point. And so as you likely know, since the start of the pandemic, the federal government has passed several proposals that provide emergency relief funds to the states and local governments. And so what you're seeing now is a handy chart that shows the dates of the enactment, the total funding for the bills, the total K-12 education funding levels and allocations within those bills, and then the percent of the funding that is actually making it down to the local levels of that education money to be used on a wide array of activities, including summer and after school programs. And I know our organizations have done previous webinars on these bills if you all need to go back for a refresher. But again, this is just sort of the overview context of what we're looking at in the past year in terms of education funding. All three of the bills are intended to provide extremely flexible funding opportunities for the states and the districts, and the K-12 funding has been funneled to the states and districts via the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, otherwise known as ESSER, and you'll be hearing us talk about ESSER funds quite a lot. It is important to note, and we'll get into the details in a second, that the first two relief bills did not include dedicated set aside funding for out of school time activities through direct contracts and providers, but rather gave the districts the flexibility to sub-grant out to out of school time providers. And so summer and after school, rather than like having a dedicated pot of money, was actually just one of many allowable uses. And so that's again, these funds are incredibly flexible. Aaron, if you could please go to the next slide. Awesome. Okay, so now getting into the American Rescue Plan and the education provisions within this historic package. One of the main issues that our organization saw playing out at the local level was that not enough of the funds from these previous two packages that I just mentioned were reaching the out of school time communities and the providers that have been serving at increased capacities through the pandemic. So what we've been finding is that as districts are either sitting on some of those funds or being cautious about sub-granting, that our providers have not been getting enough to actually continue serving the students in a manner that we think is necessary in terms of the adequate supports needed to continue these services. And so in order to alleviate the burden on school districts and be the strongest allies to the work that they are doing to serve the most vulnerable students during the pandemic, our national organizations coalesced around this need for dedicated funding for these programs at the state and local levels. And so in addition to our national organizations advocating for dedicated funds for these programs, Senators Murphy and Senator Bennett also understood the unique role that the out-of-school time community is playing to support these districts. And they actually championed a specific set aside at the state and local levels to ensure that the OST providers were eligible through direct grants and contracts to support the after school and summer programs. And I will say, due in large part to the advocacy, the joint advocacy efforts of these national coalitions and all of you on this call who made your voices heard, who wrote letters, who took action, who really ensured that members of Congress understood the critical services that you all are providing. It is, known at this time, but if you haven't heard yet, the final American Rescue Package actually includes a monumental and historic investment of $30 billion in dedicated funding for summer and after school programs. And so what you're seeing now on the screen is just a quick and dirty breakdown of how those funds break down at the state and local levels. So what you're seeing is of the $1.9 trillion package, there is $122 billion for K-12 education, again, through that ESSER fund that I mentioned earlier. And of that $122 billion, there is $8.45 billion available at the state education agency level. So that's what SEA is. And just to compare, that will serve about 9 million students, which is doubling the current number of students being served. And so 8.45 billion at the state education agency level to, again, have grants and contracts directly to some of these OST providers. Within that 8.45 billion at the state level, there is a 1.22 billion dollar set aside for summer enrichment, a $1.22 billion set aside for after school programs, and 5% set aside approximately $6.1 billion for learning recovery, again, including summer and after school programs. As I've mentioned a few times, because it is of utmost importance, and Eric will get into this in a little bit, is that the providers can actually be direct grantees of the funds at the state level. And then at the local education agency level, there is a $22 billion set aside of all the money going to the LEAs for learning recovery strategies, and again, including after school and summer. And so this is the part I was mentioning earlier, is that districts can choose to sub-grant even further to the OST providers. And then not directly exactly in the ESSER funds, there also was a $1 billion allocation for the Corporation for National and Community Service through AmeriCorps for positions to help, again, address learning recovery and other purposes, including getting youth back into the workforce. And so, I cannot stress enough how incredible this moment is for our community, and how as Aaron said, for all of you who have been working for decades to make sure that our underserved communities have access to these kinds of programs, I just want to personally thank you all on behalf of NSLA and our partners. This is really a moment where we can say that advocacy worked at the local, state, and federal level to accomplish something that will have a huge impact in the next few weeks as things move really quickly, but also in the next few decades. And with that, I will kick it over to Eric at After School Alliance.
Thanks, Allie. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I just want to echo everyone else's thanks for joining us today. And I've been looking at some of the questions in the Q&A and the chat. Our plan is to, as was mentioned earlier, to do an FAQ and follow up along with the slides and other resources and tools. I will drop a quick link in the chat box to a number of resources that can help as well, and that will be added to, including tables of how you can figure out how much of these funds come to your state. So I'm tasked briefly with talking through the question that we did get in the chat around how do we apply for these funds, and that's the big question. So I'm going to try to tackle that, but first I want to iterate, as Aaron mentioned, while we expect that state education agencies, actually we heard from the Department of Education yesterday that they will be getting the funds by the end of this month, by the end of March, early April at the latest. That every state and territory will have their allocation of these, what we call ESSER 3 funds in their state. State education agencies then will disperse to LEAs, which is local education agencies or school districts for shorthand, within 60 days is what the law says. We expect similar time frame and hope for similar time frame from state education agencies in terms of dispersing the state set-asides for after school, summer, and learning recovery that Ali mentioned. The funds, however, can be spent over the next 24 to 30 months, so through September 2023, and that obviously covers this summer, next summer, and the summer of 2023, as well as a little bit of this school year, not much in most places, but next school year and the school year after. Next slide, please. So there isn't an easy place to just apply for these funds. It's really going to be, while the set-asides are again for after school, summer, and what's called learning recovery interventions, just defined in part as comprehensive after school and summer learning or summer enrichment, it will be up to states to figure out how best to provide those funds to community-based organizations and to providers. They have a lot of options and some flexibility. We expect the Department of Ed will give a little bit of direction as to how those funds, but really a lot of it continues to be on all of our shoulders, including you on the phone, to make the case at the state, and we'll talk about local level too, but for this slide, make the case at the state level for how these funds can best be used to be provided to nonprofit organizations, as well as faith-based providers, libraries, parks and rec, the whole cohort of out-of-school time providers at the local level. So reaching out to working with other entities in your state, statewide after-school network, state park and rec, Boys and Girls Club Y, and other state level organizations, as well as children's and education groups at the state level to help make the case. Reaching out and asking your state education agency once the funds come, in late March, what their plan is for getting these funds to after school and summer learning providers. There's a variety of mechanisms they could use. They could use 21st Century Community Learning Centers for enroll part of the funds in there potentially. They could do a third-party grant that we saw with the previous COVID dollars in states like Tennessee that went through the statewide United Way. They could do a competition held by the state education agency. So lots of options there. And it really is going to depend on each state as to how they best tackle getting these funds out. And then on the local level, encouraging state education agencies to encourage local school districts to partner with community-based organizations and after-school and summer providers who have experience in doing this work in positive youth development. Next slide. So at the local level, with that 20% set aside that Ali mentioned, so about $22 billion that local school districts across the country, not all of them, but the vast majority of them that work with low-income students will have this task that they're going to have to spend collectively, all of them together, $22 billion on learning recovery interventions to accelerate learning, to support students academically, but also social and emotionally, particularly students hardest hit by the pandemic. And so reaching out to your school district to ask how they plan to spend those funds, encouraging needs assessments to make sure parents and young people, children and students and youth have a say in how those funds are spent. Share examples and evidence of your own and of others of how positive youth development programs at the local level can work in out of school time and summer and after school and weekends to help support young people, demonstrate your connections with students and families, and then finally being prepared to share details on what a program could look like that you might work in partnership with them. Again, lots more to come on this and a lot of it at the state level. And we look forward to providing resources and tools to help you make the case. And I will now hand it over to my colleagues at Boys and Girls Club of America.
Thanks, Eric, appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for joining today. Sage Learn, National Director of Government Relations for Boys and Girls Clubs of America. I wanted to highlight a couple additional business model supports for nonprofits that were included in the American Rescue Plan. There was a third round of funding for the Paycheck Protection Program with another increase of $7.25 billion. The loan eligibility is the same as the second round. It did expand the eligibility to charitable nonprofits that operate at multiple locations, but that don't have more than 500 employees per location. And additionally, the current application deadline is March 31st, 2021, unless it is extended by Congress. So still March 31st is the deadline. Another item I wanted to highlight was for self-insured nonprofits, the benefits or the relief provided for that unemployment insurance benefit coverage was increased. The federal payments were increased from 50% to 75% of the cost, which will go into effect on March 31st. And extending that coverage through September 6th, 2021. I also wanted to highlight, not included in American Rescue Plan, but as we're talking about business model supports for nonprofits, a bill that was reintroduced as we look towards the next COVID package in Congress. It is the Work Opportunities and Resources to Keep Nonprofit Organizations Well Act, or for short, Work Now Act, much easier to say. It was just reintroduced last week in the Senate. The bill number is S740. It was led by Senators Klobuchar, Schatz, Wyden, and Brown. And there's companion legislation that is being led in the House by Congresswoman Linda Sanchez, which will be introduced this week. What the Work Now Act would do is it would create a $50 billion grant program for nonprofit organizations to help meet the needs from increased costs and demand in services that have been caused by the COVID pandemic. While also helping to retain and rehire employees. How the breakdown would go is there would be 20% for national organizations to pass through to local affiliates, 75% to go to state and local for nonprofits, and 2% set aside for tribes. And so really the reasoning behind this bill is, as we know, for many nonprofits, PPP was a critical stopgap and created relief to address for businesses and many nonprofits. But we know there's still a lot of unmet need. And one of the challenges for nonprofits throughout the pandemic that have been providing critical community services is it was the lost revenue, but also the increased cost in services that had just as big an impact. So this is really intended to help provide relief specifically for nonprofits that are facing some of these increased costs and lost revenue, so they can maintain and rehire employees and continue those critical services. So the intent is to show support for this bill so it could possibly be included in the next COVID package. So I would encourage folks to reach out to their members of Congress in support of this. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Kate Claybaugh.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Sage. Kate Claybaugh, Director of Government Relations for Boys and Girls Clubs of America. Wanted to talk today about our role in advocacy around emergency childcare funding. For full disclosure, for the most part, Boys and Girls Clubs are actually childcare license exempt in several states, and emergency childcare funding is not necessarily a source we had worked on previous to the crisis, but as clubs remained open, particularly to provide care for the children of essential and healthcare workers, we definitely saw an uptick in the need for care for the children of teachers once the school year started. And certainly as in local communities, the childcare sector individually has been so hard hit, clubs are really stepping in new ways to fill those gaps. So we, as a movement, have spent several years, as I'm sure several of you have, defining ourselves as not childcare. So we're going to call ourselves a quality, safe place for school-age kids to be, and we will remain open to the greatest extent possible for the duration of this crisis for emergency childcare purposes. But what's been interesting in the advocacy on this is really helping the U.S. Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families better understand the role of school-age providers offering childcare for school-age kids. And I really just believe the conversation has really evolved in a very positive way. There's in fact a relatively new office under ACF that I've just been recently introduced to, the National Center on After School and Summer Enrichment, which I encourage all of you to look for new resources. They're very interested in how school-age providers are providing a safe place for care for school-age kids. And so in the advocacy, while my intention was a specific call out for the words license exempt providers to be eligible. We didn't quite get that, but we do feel as though licensed, regulated, or registered in the state does open up a new opportunity. And how I've been messaging this with our Boys and Girls Clubs in particular, we believe the new Child Care Stabilization Fund is a really important opportunity for school age only providers. It in fact is an opportunity for the direct payments to providers as opposed to needing to go through the families who are eligible, which we think is very important. And we really appreciated the specific call out for the allowable uses of these new funds. In particular, I want to point out for the mental health support of children and employees. I know we're all very concerned about that issue. So the way in which we can draw down funds to support, especially as we return to programming this summer, the emotional wellness needs of our kids and staff. And I do want to especially flag that this funding is only available until September 30th, 2021. So it does feel as if the urgency to get these funds out the door will be there in terms of some incentivizing there. So that is it for childcare. Next, please. So also wanted to highlight some really important work that's been happening in the federal child nutrition space throughout COVID. I couldn't be prouder of all the clubs, YMCA, Park and Rec agencies. I know all of you have really stepped up in incredible ways during this crisis. Right at the onset, even if we had clubs closed for in-person programming, they were packing up meals in their programming vans, taking them to children's homes, having parents pick up multiple meals at a time. And that was all made possible from some swift action by USDA to waive certain requirements and provide flexibilities for sites and sponsors of the summer nutrition programs. The wonderful news is not only have those flexibilities because of all of our collective advocacy remained in place for this school year, just last week they were actually extended through the end of the fiscal year, so September 30th, 2021. But what that means is we all have an incredible opportunity this summer to serve meals. FNS, the Food Nutrition Service, federally is very committed to increasing the number of sites and sponsors. I will give a caveat to all of you at the local level. We have been hearing certain states are giving priority to school districts to serve meals first ahead of community-based organizations, but that is not the intention of the federal agency. And so where you're getting that level of response from your state nutrition state agency, please let us know at the national level so we can keep an eye on that. But I would say with these extended flexibilities to actually think about, we are currently technically living in a world of universal summer meals. The area eligibility requirement, for example, has been waived. So what that means is anyone interested in any community technically can now participate in the program. And as we all want to invite as many kids back for programming as possible this summer, I really encourage the use of the federal child nutrition programs to be right in lockstep. So we're getting our kids back to nutritious foods, talking to them about healthy meals, and certainly combating hunger that is no doubt increased during this crisis. And some kids, in fact, have faced hunger for the very first time. So for more information on that, please let me know. Always happy to help. And thank you so much to NSLA for having me.
Awesome. And I think, Tiffany, you are up next.
Yes. Hi. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Love to see, I think, 1,200 people on, which is incredible. I think it just shows the amount of interest in this important legislation. Something that I work for, I'm Vice President of Policy for Communities and Schools, our model is an integrated student supports model. And in some places within our network across the country, we're part of community schools. And so one thing that we have worked on and we were so incredibly happy to see is that community schools got a specific call out in this legislation, specifically for the 20% set aside at the local level. So In addition to being focused on addressing learning loss within subgroups of students, which includes students living in poverty, students from students of color, students who have been historically marginalized. 20%, as Eric said, I think in his part, must be set aside to address the learning loss through evidence-based interventions that respond to the social, emotional, and academic needs of students. And as you all know, I don't need to really say this, but the toll that the pandemic has taken on our communities and our students and our families has been incredibly great. And I like to talk about this also, and we almost have two pandemics happening at the same time. And so we have the health one, and then on top of that, we have several communities that have really been dealing with the racial reckoning in this country that we're going through right now, as recent as yesterday. So all of that is to say that our programs are really designed for this moment, right? So we are addressing the social emotional needs of students. We're often either providing mental health services or connecting students with mental health services. And in particular, being able to use these funds to implement full service community schools in communities across the country would be a huge step in the right direction. We were really excited to see that in this legislation. I would also just advise for those of you in particular that are operating programs within a community school to just keep an eye out, because the new administration is very supportive of community schools. And we anticipate seeing a lot more talk about community schools. The president has pledged to open up community schools to at least 300,000 more students. I anticipate also a lot more funding being dedicated to community schools in the future. Also part of the set aside that is important is implementing evidence-based practices and activities to meet the comprehensive needs of students. Again, things that all of your programs are already doing, supporting parents and families, tracking student attendance. In particular, for those of you that are part of integrated student supports models, tracking attendance and improving student engagement is something that all of us are focusing on incredibly right now. Also, re-engagement. We're hearing a lot in our communities and schools network about school districts and our affiliates specifically hiring re-engagement staff, where their only responsibility is to do porch visits and really go door to door and try to find so many of the students that have gone missing throughout this pandemic, and get them reconnected with school, re-engaged, and back in our programs. That's not on the slide, but something I just want to be sure to make sure you're all aware of. In addition to the set-asides that we've been talking about in the additional funds, funding can also, the rest of the funding can be used for activities that are already allowed in the Every Student Succeeds Act. And so if you are looking to hire community school coordinators or site coordinators for integrated student supports, in addition to some of the set aside funds where those are allowable uses, you can also point to the existing legislation within the Every Student Succeeds Act as allowable uses of funds as well. So the mental health supports that we will, that our programs across the country will need in order to help our students reconnect. If you have students who are already participating, if you have students that you're looking for, either way, so many of them are going to need mental health supports. And so there's several different programs that were included within this piece of legislation that can help. And so one of them that and I'll just talk a little bit more about one of them, is Project Aware, which stands for Advancing Wellness and Resilience in Education. It's an SEA, State Education Agency grant primarily, where they are partnering with your school districts or local education agencies. I saw in the chat that a few folks were wondering what SEA and LEA stood for. And really the purpose is to increase awareness of mental health issues among school-aged youth, provide training for school personnel and other adults who are interacting with our students, and to detect and respond to mental health issues. And so if you are providing some of those supports, or if your school or school district wants you to provide some of those supports, this is a possible funding source that they can tap into to actually pay for the work that you're doing. Something else, so the youth suicide prevention got $20 million, which we're incredibly happy to see. And then $10 million for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which is also another important source of funding, really to help and sort of coordinate and integrate services for traumatized children, their families, and communities throughout the country. So again, another 3 important sources for mental health support, because we know that this past year, if you think it's been hard on us, it's been incredibly hard on our students and their families. And so wanted to be able to share some of those resources that you or your school districts or your states can tap into to help provide some of these sources. And I think I turn it over to Henry.
Great, thank you, Tiffany, I appreciate that. So a couple of bullets about delivering in-person programs for youth. The American Camp Association has been in close collaboration with the CDC, and they are working on updating their guidance for youth programs and camps. They came out with the new school guidance about a month or so ago, and they are now focused on providing this guidance. We think that it will be out somewhere around mid-April or maybe a little bit before that. They are looking at a robust and growing cadre of research that is out there about the pandemic and about the use of multi-layered non-pharmaceutical interventions. So think masks, cohorting, social distancing, increasing hygiene practices, all those sorts of things. There's a wide body of research that shows that the implementation of those strategies together allows you to provide in-person programming for youth in a way that protects the participants, the staff, and the local community. And so they are looking at the same research that we have looked at in the development of our field guide for camps. Prior to last summer, we hired a public health consulting company to help us develop a tactical implementation guide so that camps and other youth programs would know how to implement the guidance coming out of CDC and at the state level. And that we have aligned that field guide with the growing evidence that's out there. And this is the same evidence that the CDC is looking at. So we expect that we will have new guidance here within a month, hopefully even before them. We expect that they will align very, very strongly with the use of multi-layered non-pharmaceutical interventions. And another benefit that has come out of the collaboration through this pandemic has been that the CDC has said to us explicitly that their schools group, which is also in charge of the out of school time and camps, was aware of the out of school time, but was not aware of the significant role they play in supporting the youth across our summer to the degree that you all do. And so we do believe that this collaboration will last well beyond the specific situation that we're in now. And we look forward to continuing to collaborate with them. And one thing that we are doing, I'll jump to the, so there's the next bullet. One thing that we are doing is we're working with the CDC to host a webinar specific for state and local health officials so that they can fully understand the multi-layered protections, how effective they are, and the science that guides those, so that they will be able to work with schools and other youth serving programs to make sure that the guidance is right and not overly restrictive. I will say that states, this has started happening in the past month or so, states have begun updating their rules for youth programs and day and overnight camps. Many of the states that had not allowed overnight camp are allowing them now. Many states are also updating their day camp guidance, which also applies to youth programs that aren't structured just like day camps. Know that that guidance is coming out at the state level, and we have supported state level decision makers in making sure that they're writing that guidance in a broad enough way so that programs can adapt to that based on individual situations. So one point that I'll lift up here is that there is a difference between the guidance that's coming out from the CDC and the states and the protocols that an individual program may put in place. The guidance is based on the evidence, and last year there were no vaccines, and testing was not as available and was very expensive, and there was a time delay in getting results back. So many youth programs that were able to operate didn't have the benefit of any of those, and the science shows that the multi-layered NPIs work without those additional supports. So you will see guidance in many states are written, and the CDC guidance may well also be written, that has no requirement for pre-programmed screening testing. One good example of how the difference between the protocols that you may implement and the guidance will be is that the evidence shows that there's not an increase or a decrease in risk by decreasing cohort size. So you can essentially adapt the cohort size to a way that meets your program model the best. Therefore, guidance may not have a requirement for a minimum cohort size. However, there are lots of management reasons to have minimum cohort sizes, in that if there is a suspected case of COVID, you'll have to contact, trace, and isolate everybody in that cohort. So just one note that the guidance may look different than your individual protocols, and there are resources like the field guide and other resources out there for you to help you understand what your protocols are. But we ought to have guidance for how to move forward in these programs, and we're already beginning to see that at the state level. The last thing that I will say is the ACA worked with a number of other national youth serving organizations to have a sign-on letter and an outreach to the CDC when their ACIP committee was thinking about the prioritization of vaccinations. And our ask was to include out of school time workers as essential workers, much in the same way that educators are included in that. And the ACIP committee did expand the language in that essential worker category in a way that was meant to include out of school time workers. That was great news. They've aligned their website in a way that supports that as well. Of course, here the CDC just makes recommendations, and governors and state level decision makers decide how it works in their state. What we understand is many states aren't including right now out of school time workers in their vaccination if they're at that phase yet, and many of them are. There are a few states that have not yet gotten to that, and some of those categories got fragmented a little bit with the push to reopen schools. So I'm in North Carolina, the essential workers category, they pulled the teachers out and put them there was a kind of a essential workers A and B. So that's happened across the country, but we do believe that as we are getting better at distributing the vaccinations, that we're actually moving more quickly through the different categories. And we feel good that by the summertime, out of school time workers, even in the states where they're not explicitly prioritized ahead of some of those groups, will have ready access to the vaccine. Of course, participants will most likely not. Right now, there's only one vaccine that is available for individuals that are 16. The others are 18, but one is for 16 and up. And there are studies going on for youth below 16 to 12. They may have results in the next couple of months, but even students below 12 years old, we don't expect to see that until the fall. And so your participants won't have vaccinations available to them. That's why you need the multi-layered non-pharmaceutical interventions in order to protect the participants and the staff and the community. But vaccination should be readily available for workers. So a little update on the guidance that's out there and that's coming, the resources, and the state of vaccinations.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Allie and Kate and Sage and Eric and Tiffany and Henry for sharing all this information. Again, we're collecting all the questions that people are putting into the Q&A box. We're going to, again, be responding to all of you, and everyone who's registered will receive an FAQ, the answers to the best of our abilities in the next few days. But if you have more questions, or as you think about this, we're also going to be sending out this recording so you can share it with anyone who was not on as well. You could email your questions. We'll collect more questions. Allie has volunteered to receive those questions. If Allie, you put your email in the chat box, your personal email, she'll take those and add those to our group here. But again, we'll return some time to people. But again, this is a wonderful moment. Wonderful opportunity for us to be responsive to the needs of our students, our families, and our schools and our communities. We are doing so much together. It's a great honor to work side by side with all of you. And thank you again for our panelists. Thank you for everyone who joined us on this call. We'll be sharing this information. And again, if you have more questions, if you have needs, if you have questions, or if you have resources you want to share more widely with our field, this is a moment when we're all in this together. Navigating this and doing the best of our abilities. And so we want to be able to share the best practices everyone's developing and has. So with that, thank you, everyone. We will be in touch soon, but again, send any additional questions to Allie Talcott at ally@stepupadvocacy.com. Thank you to our wonderful co-sponsoring organizations, Communities and Schools, After School Alliance, Boys and Girls Club of America, American Camp Association, and also the YMCA USA. We'll be in touch soon as we make this summer the biggest and best ever, and also prepare everyone for the coming school year. Talk to everyone soon.